Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Infinity is a program about alternative approaches to life. For the next half hour, we'll try to put the whole world in a test tube. Our guest is Fritjof Capra, a physicist who received his doctorate from the University of Vienna and has conducted research in high-energy physics at major universities in the United States and Europe. Dr. Capra is the author of The Tao of Physics, one of the first in a growing field of books on the relationship of science and consciousness. His most recent book is The Turning Point. Dr. Capra is founder of the Elmwood Institute, which helps to realize this worldview and attempts to sort out global problems. The Elmwood Institute is a greenhouse for new ecological visions. If principles of physics apply on a grand scale, can you study societies the same way you study objects in a laboratory?
No. It is a misperception to say that principles of physics apply on a grand scale. They do apply to the physical universe on a grand scale, to galaxies, stars, and so on, but they do not apply to human societies. They do not apply to ecosystems, to living organisms. But what fascinated me as a physicist was that in the 1920s, or during the first 3 decades of the century, there was a profound change of concepts in physics, and that a similar change is now happening in other fields, and that's what I wrote about in The Turning Point. So there are principles similar to the principles of physics that are now being found in other fields, and there is a general change of paradigm or worldview of our way of seeing the world, of our vision of reality that is now happening.
Is there a chicken and egg relationship as the principles of physics changed or are changing? Is that directly related, or is it totally separate from the new world view?
No, it is very much related, but I think chicken and egg characterizes it very well. You might say that physics was the first science in which our concepts of reality changed in a very basic way. But then this was also an age, the first decades of the century was also the age of Impressionist paintings, and this was the age where in the paintings of Picasso, for instance, bodies disintegrated, or in other art there was a change of consciousness toward a deeper level. So it was a certain zeitgeist, collective consciousness, I think, that changed. And in science, it came about in physics at first, and then in other sciences later.
One of the areas that's changing in physics is the concept of objectivity, that the observer is separate from the experiment. And we know and have discussed on many occasions that more and more of the observer cannot be separated from the experiment and is a part of it. Does that apply sociologically as well?
Yes, I think that applies to all the fields, and I've just recently found a very nice illustration of this, which I'd like to show you verbally. Think of a Rorschach test, and think of this interconnected ink blot. And suppose we had one here, and I asked you, what do you see in this? And you might say, well, over there I see a bird. And if I asked somebody else, he or she might say, well, I see a flower, or I see an airplane or something. Now, how can different people see different objects? Well, what happens is that we disconnect the so-called objects, the part of the blot from the rest. That is, we cut through the interconnections and isolate it and define it by isolating it. But we do this in different ways. So we neglect certain connections that we think less relevant and thereby define the object. So we can learn from this that whenever you have a totally interconnected reality, and when you define objects, first of all, this will always be approximate. This will be an approximate definition, or it will be an illusion, as they would say in mystical traditions. And secondly, you can learn that different people will do it in a different way. And this is how the observer comes in, you see? According to what we bring to the picture that we look at, we divide it up into objects. And this is what physicists found out in the 1920s, and what Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of atomic physics, formulated and formalized in his uncertainty principle.
What is the application in terms of the interconnectedness or the separateness of the observer when you're talking about societies and the way we live and the quality of life?
Well, when you talk about our society, then I am talking about a worldview that is now emerging, which is consistent with the worldview in physics and which could be called best in ecological worldview. It's based on this awareness of fundamental interconnectedness, and furthermore on the awareness of being embedded in larger systems, on the awareness of individuals and societies being embedded in the cyclical processes of nature. Now, this has very important and dramatic consequences, because if we are connected to the rest of the world and in fact embedded in it, then everything we do will travel around in our environment and eventually come back. There is no such thing, for example, as dumping some waste somewhere else, because in a closed, interconnected environment, there's no somewhere else. You dump it somewhere, and then the effects travel. And here comes another very important point. In ecosystems, as in all living systems, the pathways of connections are non-linear, circles and more complicated non-linear interconnections. Therefore, when you put something out, it will eventually come back. And that's what we're now learning very painfully with nuclear waste and with toxic waste dumps and all other kinds of waste that we have put in the environment.
Is it short-sighted of us to think in terms of a global view or a world vision or just this world? Would it be better, since we've already started the transformation in thinking and come to a higher level and have lost some of the elements of provincialism, to think in terms of a universal view, to think of not just this planet but all planets, and not just this solar system but all solar systems?
Yes, I think certainly the next step would be to think about other solar systems and to think about the universe as a whole. But practically, we are still so far behind of thinking about this planet as a whole, of thinking about the human family as a whole. We still, for instance, think in terms of national security, whereas with nuclear weapons there cannot be such a thing as national security. There can only be global security. So we are still very far from this global thinking as far as our Earth is concerned. Now, in the meantime, I think you had people on the program, astronauts or people, Rusty Schweikert, I understand, was here. You see, these astronauts really had an immediate experience of this global vision when they saw the Earth there as a shining blue planet out against the black sky. This was a deep experience, which most of them said was a spiritual experience. But here on Earth, we are still very far from this experience of the Earth as a whole and of the human family as a whole. But that's really what I'm talking about.
When you talk about the change that took place in the 1920s in physics, and yet you say that it's not a linear situation, some people have suggested that change that took place in the 20s and the change that's taking place now in terms of developing an ecological view is really circling back to the beginning and some of the ancient traditions and the mystical traditions. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I myself was one of the first to suggest that in my first book, The Tao of Physics. The worldview that has emerged from modern physics and is now emerging from the other sciences is a holistic or ecological view, and it is indeed very similar to the views of mystical traditions. I was particularly interested in Eastern traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, but also Christian mystics have expressed similar views. Native American cultures have expressed similar views, Aborigines all over the world. It is a view that is very characteristic of traditional cultures, and a view that we have lost with the mechanization of our society, with the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of modern science, and to which we are now coming back. So it is a sort of a circular cultural development.
What are some of the specific basics of the mystical or ancient traditions that are re-emerging now with the new world vision?
I would say that there are two fundamental themes that run through all the mystical traditions. There are, of course, traditions, all over the world and have been throughout the ages, and they're very different in many ways. But those two themes, you could say, run through them. One is